Over the next several weeks, you'll meet a number of artists, CalArts faculty and alumni, who joined me to explore a work of art relevant to the week's theme in greater detail. For this first week, though, we are doing something a bit different to help you prepare for your own coursework and the peer review process by which the work will be reviewed. One of the most important things for any artist is to learn how to give and get constructive feedback on their work. This critique process, as it's called in art schools, is central to teaching and learning at CalArts. And there's a citation on the course syllabus page for a really wonderful essay on one of the most renowned critique seminars at CalArts, taught for years by Michael Asher. So I sat down with 3 CalArts MFA students to talk about the critique process and about how artists absorb feedback, both good and bad, into their working process. The first thing to notice as we watch the studio visits that I did with each of you is I don't think any of us use the words good, bad, I like that, but it's not criticism, right? It's critique. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how we think about what we bring to that and what we need from it as artists.
I think the distinction between criticism and critique is, fundamental in understanding how to access a critique and how to then direct it. We tend to expect criticism instead of directing a critique.
Yeah, and I think too, words like I like it or I don't like it or this is good or this is bad, that at some really broad level, critique is trying to get at that, but it's trying to just get you to articulate, well, if you think it's bad, you probably have a philosophical position on why.
It's also a kind of form of research in that way too, because we start out as artists with this notion of I want to do something or I'd like to see something that looks like this or works like that. And then the thing that we do goes out in the world and becomes a thing in its own right and exists as a public gesture or object. And it may be read completely differently than the way we intend it.
I think they're most beneficial when something unexpected happens or when somebody is, for example, offended by a piece, or there's something that could easily be relegated to a good or bad, and then to question why that reaction happened. Not that the reaction itself doesn't matter, but more importantly, why it happened. Because then you can arrive at something in the piece that could be problematic, which might be interesting.
There's all these different emotional narratives that happen in a critique, where you're putting something that you're very close to out, but that ultimately there's all these kind of emotional flows around your work because you are invested in it as an artist. And so words like problematic might come up. I'm a performer. Sometimes performers call out the audience in a way that puts them on the spot, And so when someone says this is problematic, I'm like, awesome, because that's what you should be making as an artist, is problems for reality,
How are people responding? How are they reading this? Am I communicating ideas? And maybe they are seeing things that I don't see, I wasn't even conscious of. I wasn't even aware that this was in the work, but look, there it is.
As artists, we have to figure out what's that moment in the work's development where we can afford to have it come into public for critique, and having that critique be generative rather than foreclosing an idea. So how do you sort that out in terms of when it's your turn for critique, what you're going to bring?
I personally can never show something that is in process. Even if it's performatively or narratively, or I'm going to orate something, that it has to feel like a finished presentation. Even if the idea that I'm presenting might be about something that's not there.
Right.
So it needs to feel like now I've created a performance about this object that's not present. I
can see why it's almost safer in some instances to show documentation of something that has already happened, or and it's a little stranger and perhaps riskier to show something that's completely undeveloped but is still in process. And in that kind of space of potentiality, there's risk, but I think that's also the best moment to show work.
One of the great gifts of being in school, especially as an MFA student, is to have people agree to spend that much time talking about your work. But you need that when you're not in art school as well. So how do you think about building the community that you need to sustain your work through critique when you leave CalArts?
I'm just sort of counting on that I'm going to have friends. You know, I came to school, I'm part of a community, they have friends, I'm going out, I'm going to openings, I'm going to become part of, you know, a larger community that exists out there. And while we're probably not all going to go over to someone's apartment and look at, you know, like their video or whatever and sit and critique about it, you're going to have these encounters, probably more on a one-on-one basis. But I mean, I'm just haven't crossed that bridge yet, but I'm just assuming that this is going to come through friendships, you know.
I think that like the networks are real, and the people that you bond with, like that will carry outside of, you know, the institution. And if it doesn't, you can always imagine, you know, like, well, what would so and so say, and you can kind of perform.
You can start to ventriloquize.
I do. I have art friends in art that have graduated from grad school, and I go to their studio and we talk about their work. And it's more like a, hey, let's go grab lunch, and we maybe go for a swim at the local pool or something, and then we end up at the studio, and we're like, oh, this thing's weird, you know. But we can talk in these candid terms, and then slowly the critical discourse emerges. Right. And sometimes, oh, so-and-so's down the street, maybe we should get them involved, and then now we have like a 3-person critique. So it is a lot more casual in that sense, but it could be more formal. If whatever you decide as a community that you want, you can create that.
Right?
Yeah.
Let me ask the question from the other side. We've talked a little bit about, you know, how we either direct or negotiate the critique of our own work, but what about being the member of that community whose job at the moment is to offer the critique to somebody else? When you put that other hat on, how do you think about what your work and your responsibility is? You use the word ethics, but
for me, I'm a verbal processor, and so when I'm engaging with somebody's work, it's just really, I'm always engaging with a thing in the world, and now this becomes a thing that I know that someone else spent a lot of time hoping that I would unpack something out of it, but really it's just this thing that I'm kind of bouncing off of. And I just think coming to it with a sense of investment for them in some senses, but also for myself, that I'm going to see how I think by reflecting off of this object out loud. That's great, you know, because then I'm learning just as much as they're taking something from the piece or something.
How do you navigate hearing things you don't want to hear?
That's sometimes the best thing, though.
Yeah.
I love hearing things that I don't want to hear, I don't like to hear, and I anticipate those things, or I try to anticipate those things. And so when it happens, more like the most important thing to do is to question why. So what is it about this thing that I heard that I didn't want to hear that that truly troubles me, or where does it come from? What place does it come from? And what is it really saying?
On the larger social scale, but certainly as an artist, you need to be willing to accept that there's a diversity of opinions and a diversity of viewpoints, and that this is something that you have to wrestle with.
Being able to see when something you don't want to hear could be a positive platform for you to engage with, and when it could be something that's malicious, or, you know, I mean, as much as we want to think that this process of engaging with art is totally benevolent and we're all here for each other, that there are times where a tit for tat happens, or like someone is having a bad day and they just feel like slamming your art, you know, they just feel like really just like handing it to somebody, and that you kind of have to recognize that the critique is not a vacuum, that there's all these people with all these different life experiences coming to it, and they're going to throw something off the wall sometimes, and you've got to just be able to catch it and go like, hey.
One of the things you learn is how to sort out the things that you need to hear from the things that you're just going to let slide off of you. And any artist has to have that balance between kind of openness and an internal integrity that I think they have to practice too in order to hone it.
It's harder to navigate silence in a critique.
Right.
And it is
because
it's nice when you get like a reaction, whether it's, you know, a strong reaction, positive or negative, whether it's a result of someone's bad day or whatever it is, or their own filter that's clearly they're just seeing what they're working on because that's all they can think about, or they read something once and they haven't read it enough and that's all they can read, you know, everywhere else.
Indifference is the worst criticism.
Yeah, that's harder to navigate.
So part of the reason in the end we're thinking about this is because many of the assignments in this course are going to be peer assessed, and we will have a very large community of artists and students from all over the world that are going to be engaged in this process. So our conversation today was in a way to start everybody thinking about how they are going to participate in what is a very potentially unwieldy but also really dynamic community of artists online.